Have you ever noticed how the harder you try to fix yourself, the more broken you feel? There's something deeply strange about self-improvement, isn't there? You wake up one morning, look in the mirror, and decide that the person staring back at you isn't good enough, not disciplined enough, not confident enough, not successful enough. So you declare war. You download the apps, buy the books, set the alarms. You become a soldier in your own private battle, fighting against yourself. But here's the paradox that nobody talks about. The very act of trying to improve yourself requires you to split in two. There's the current you, flawed, weak, unacceptable, and the future you, perfect, strong, finally worthy. One is the enemy, the other is the prize, and you're somehow both the warrior and the battlefield, the judge and the accused, the sculptor and the stone. You're trying to win a war where victory means destroying yourself to become yourself. What if I told you that this entire framework is backwards? That the exhaustion you feel isn't from lack of discipline, but from the constant violence of self-rejection? What if the path forward doesn't involve winning the war at all, but understanding why you declared it in the first place? Today, we're going to explore something that might change everything. The possibility that self-improvement, as most people practice it, is actually self-abandonment in disguise. And more importantly, we're going to discover what it means to call a truce with yourself, not as surrender, but as the deepest transformation you'll ever experience. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine someone, let's call her Sarah. Sarah wakes up every morning at 5 a.m. She meditates, journals, exercises, reads 10 pages of a self-help book, and prepares a nutritious breakfast, all before most people hit snooze for the second time. Her calendar is color-coded, her goals are smart, her affirmations are posted on her bathroom mirror. From the outside, Sarah is winning, but inside, Sarah is exhausted, because every single day is a report card. Every meal is a test. Every moment of rest feels like failure. The self-improvement routine that was supposed to set her free has become a prison with very comfortable bars. Now consider Marcus. Marcus tried the Sarah approach and burned out hard, so he went the other direction. He decided to accept himself as he is. He unfollowed all the productivity gurus, deleted the tracking apps, and embraced radical self-compassion. But 6 months later, Marcus finds himself depressed and directionless. He's accepted himself, sure, but he's also accepted his isolation, his unfulfilled potential, his quiet desperation. He's stopped fighting, but he hasn't found peace. He's just stuck. Both Sarah and Marcus are caught in the same trap, just from different angles. They're operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about what it means to change, to grow, to become more fully themselves. And here's what makes this so insidious. Our entire culture reinforces this misunderstanding. We're told that growth requires discipline, which requires force, which requires treating yourself like a misbehaving child who needs constant correction. Think about the language we use. We attack our goals, we crush our workouts, we kill our old habits. We dominate our day. It's all warfare metaphors, all violence directed inward. We've turned self-development into self-destruction, personal growth into personal combat. And the strangest part, we think this is normal. We think this is healthy. We celebrate the person who gets up at 4 a.m. to run in the freezing cold, not because they love it, but because they're tough enough to force themselves. We admire the entrepreneur who works 80-hour days, sacrificing sleep, relationships, and sanity on the altar of success. But here's what we don't talk about: the inevitable crash, because you can't sustain a war forever. Eventually, Sarah burns out. Eventually, Marcus gives up. Eventually, every person who's trying to improve themselves through force and self-rejection hits a wall. And when they do, they blame themselves for lacking willpower, lacking commitment, lacking whatever quality they think separates the winners from the losers. They never question the approach itself. They just try harder, which means rejecting themselves more deeply, which means the war intensifies. This is the great unspoken crisis of our self-improvement obsessed culture. We have more resources for personal development than any generation in history. More books, more courses, more coaches, more apps, more techniques. And yet anxiety and depression are at all-time highs. People are more disconnected from themselves than ever. Why? Because we're trying to build a house while simultaneously tearing down the foundation. The conventional wisdom says that self-improvement requires three things: a clear vision of who you want to be, honest assessment of your current flaws, and the discipline to bridge the gap. Identify, target, execute, simple, right, except it's based on a lie. The lie is that you're fundamentally flawed and need to be fixed. The lie is that your current self is the problem, and some future self is the solution. The lie is that transformation happens through force rather than through understanding. And this lie has consequences that ripple through every area of your life. Your relationships suffer because you can't be present. You're too busy monitoring whether you're being your best self. Your work suffers because you're never satisfied, always chasing the next milestone that will finally prove you're enough. Your inner life becomes a battleground where every impulse, every desire, every moment of weakness is evidence of your inadequacy. What very few people realize is that this approach doesn't just fail to work. It actively prevents the transformation you're seeking. Because real change doesn't happen through rejection. It happens through integration, and you can't integrate what you're at war with. Carl Jung understood something that most of the modern self-improvement industrial complex misses entirely. The psyche doesn't respond to force. It responds to relationship. When you declare war on aspects of yourself, those aspects don't disappear. They don't surrender. They go underground. They become what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is everything you've decided is unacceptable about yourself. It's the lazy part when you've decided you must be productive. It's the angry part when you've decided you must be kind. It's the scared part when you've decided you must be brave. And here's what's crucial. The shadow doesn't go away just because you reject it. Instead, it grows more powerful, more insistent, more destructive. It sabotages you in ways you don't consciously recognize. Think about it. Sarah, with her perfect morning routine, finds herself watching Netflix until 2 a.m., even though she knows she'll regret it. Why? Because the part of her that wants rest, that wants spontaneity, that wants to not be productive for once, has been pushed into the shadow. And the shadow always gets its due. Marcus, who embraced radical acceptance, secretly harbors intense judgments about people who are hards, and fake. Why? Because the part of him that wants to strive, to achieve, to become more than he is, has been pushed into the shadow. It emerges as projection onto others. This is what Jung called the law of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposite when pushed to extremes. The harder you push against something, the more it pushes back. The more you try to be only light, the darker your shadow becomes. The more you try to be only spontaneous, the more you're secretly controlled by reaction against structure. What Jung discovered through decades of working with patients was that the path to wholeness, what he called individuation, doesn't run through perfecting yourself. It runs through integrating yourself, and integration means making conscious what you've made unconscious. It means bringing the shadow into the light, not to destroy it, but to understand it, to dialogue with it, to discover what it's trying to tell you. When you're at war with yourself, you've created what Jung would call a split in the psyche. There's the persona, the mask you show the world, the identity you're trying to maintain. And there's everything that doesn't fit that mask. The persona is, I am disciplined. The shadow holds all the moments you weren't. The persona is, I am confident. The shadow holds all your doubts and fears. And the exhausting thing about maintaining a persona through force is that it requires constant vigilance. Because the shadow is always there, always threatening to reveal itself, always exposing the gap between who you're pretending to be and who you actually are. But here's what's fascinating. Jung didn't see the shadow as the enemy. He saw it as containing everything you need for wholeness. Your shadow holds your vitality, your authentic desires, your instincts, your creative power. When you reject it, you're not just rejecting your bad parts. You're rejecting your life force itself. In the depths of the psyche, there's no such thing as a purely negative quality. What you call laziness might be your body's wisdom telling you that you need rest. What you call anger might be your healthy boundaries trying to assert themselves. What you call fear might be your intuition warning you about something genuinely dangerous. But when you're at war with these parts of yourself, you can't learn from them. You can only suppress them. And suppression takes tremendous energy that could be used for actually living. Jung worked with a concept called active imagination, a practice of dialoguing with the unconscious aspects of yourself. Instead of fighting your resistance, you'd sit with it, ask it questions, listen to what it has to say. Instead of crushing your fear, you'd explore what it's protecting you from. This isn't weakness. It's actually far more difficult than just forcing yourself to do things. Because it requires you to face aspects of yourself you've been running from your entire life. The process Jung described isn't comfortable. He called it the night sea journey, the descent into the underworld, the encounter with the dragon. These aren't metaphors for mild discomfort. They're descriptions of genuine psychological death, the death of the false self you've been maintaining through force. And here's the paradox. This death is the only path to real life. You can't become whole while rejecting half of yourself. You can't become authentic while maintaining a persona through violence. What Jung called the self-capital S isn't the ego's idea of perfection. It's the totality of who you are, light and dark, conscious and unconscious, acceptable and unacceptable. The self doesn't emerge through self-improvement. It emerges through self-acceptance in the deepest, most challenging sense. Not acceptance that says I'm fine as I am and don't need to grow, but acceptance that says I am all of this, the whole catastrophe, and that's where transformation begins. The individuation process Jung described is the journey from identification with the persona to relationship with the self. And that journey requires something that sounds simple, but is actually revolutionary. You have to stop fighting yourself. You have to call a truce, not because fighting is too hard, but because fighting is what keeps you fragmented. Integration, becoming whole, requires a fundamentally different approach. The split between who we are and who we think we should be isn't just a psychological phenomenon. It's one of the deepest philosophical problems humans face. Kierkegaard called it the sickness unto death, the despair of not willing to be oneself. We spend our lives running from our own existence, constructing elaborate systems of self-improvement that are really just sophisticated forms of self-rejection. Nietzsche saw this clearly. He watched people torture themselves with moral frameworks that demanded they become something other than what they were. He saw the life, denying nature of constant self-judgment, and he asked a provocative question: what if the problem isn't that you're not good enough, but that your idea of good enough is poisoning you? What if the standards you're failing to meet are themselves sick? This is where we have to be careful, though. Nietzsche's solution, to become the Übermensch, to create your own values, to affirm life in all its messiness, can itself become another form of the same trap, another ideal to strive toward, another way to split yourself into the current inadequate you and the future actualized you. The philosopher becomes the new tyrant, demanding authentic self-creation with the same violence that the moralist demanded virtue. Eastern philosophy offers a different perspective. Buddhism speaks of the second arrow. The first arrow is pain, it's inevitable, part of being human. The second arrow is suffering. It's what we add through our resistance to pain. When you're at war with yourself, every first arrow is followed by a volley of second arrows. You feel lazy, that's the first arrow. Then you judge yourself for being lazy, berate yourself, feel ashamed. Those are the second arrows. And often the second arrows hurt far more than the first. The Taoist tradition goes even further. It suggests that much of what we call self-improvement is actually moving away from our true nature, not toward it. We're like crooked trees trying to grow straight, not realizing that our crookedness is what makes us beautiful, what makes us us. Why effortless action doesn't mean doing nothing. It means acting in harmony with your nature rather than in opposition to it. It means finding your own shape rather than trying to fit someone else's mold. But here's the Western anxiety that immediately arises. Doesn't this lead to stagnation? If we're not constantly pushing ourselves, won't we just become complacent? This question reveals the depth of our conditioning. We can't even imagine growth that doesn't involve force. We can't conceive of transformation that doesn't require self-violence. Yet consider how you actually grew as a child. You didn't learn to walk through discipline and self-criticism. You didn't master language through forcing yourself. You grew through curiosity, through play, through organic unfolding in relationship with the world. Something in you wanted to walk, so you tried, fell, tried again. Not because you hated your crawling self, but because walking was calling to you. The growth was natural, inevitable, even joyful. What happened? When did growth become something we have to force? Somewhere along the way, we learned that our natural inclinations couldn't be trusted. We learned that desire leads to disaster. We learned that we need to be controlled, managed, improved. We internalized the voice of authority and turned it against ourselves. And we called this maturity. Existentialist philosophy grapples with this through the concept of authenticity. Heidegger wrote about thrownness, the fact that we find ourselves in a world not of our choosing, with a nature not of our making. We didn't choose our personalities, our inclinations, our struggles. We were thrown into them, and yet we're responsible for what we make of them. The question is, does that responsibility mean warring against what we were thrown into, or does it mean embracing it more deeply? Sartre added another layer with his concept of bad faith, the ways we lie to ourselves about our freedom. When you're constantly trying to improve yourself, you might think you're exercising freedom, but often you're actually fleeing from it. You're hiding in the certainty of goals and plans and systems. You're avoiding the terrifying freedom of simply being yourself, right now, without justification or improvement. There's a line from Rilke that captures this beautifully. Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act, just once, with beauty and courage. What if the parts of yourself you're at war with aren't enemies at all? What if they're treasures you haven't learned to recognize? What if your shadow, your resistance, your flaws are actually invitations to a deeper understanding of who you are? The philosophical journey here mirrors the psychological one. Both lead to the same insight. The split between who you are and who you should be is the source of suffering. Not because you need to embrace one side or the other, but because the split itself is the problem. Healing doesn't come through resolving the split by winning. It comes through dissolving the split by understanding. This is what the mystics of every tradition understood. The separate self, the ego that judges and strives and improves, is itself the illusion. Not because you don't exist, but because you exist as a whole, not as a divided territory at war with itself. The observer and the observed are one. The judger and the judged are one. When you truly see this, not intellectually but experientially, everything changes. So, what does it actually look like to call a truce with yourself? How do you move from self-improvement as warfare to transformation as integration? It starts with a radical shift in your relationship to your experience. First, you have to learn to recognize when you're at war. This shows up in your inner dialogue. Listen to how you talk to yourself when you fail to meet your own expectations. Is there kindness there, or is there harsh judgment, contempt, violence? You might notice phrases like, "What's wrong with you?" or "You're so lazy," or "You'll never change." These aren't neutral observations, they're declarations of war. They're the voice that says you as you are is unacceptable. The first step is recognizing that this voice isn't you. It's a part of you, yes, but it's not the totality of who you are. It's usually an internalized version of someone from your past, a parent, a teacher, a coach who believed that criticism and force were the paths to improvement. This voice genuinely thinks it's helping you. It thinks that if it can just be harsh enough, critical enough, you'll finally become acceptable. But it doesn't work that way. It never has. When you notice this voice, instead of fighting it or believing it, you can simply acknowledge it. Ah, there's the critic. There's the part that thinks I need to be different. You're not agreeing with it. You're not arguing with it. You're just noticing it. This small act of awareness creates space. And in that space, something new becomes possible. Next, you learn to approach your problem areas with curiosity instead of judgment. When you find yourself scrolling social media instead of working, instead of immediately criticizing yourself, you might ask, what am I actually seeking right now? What need am I trying to meet? Maybe you're exhausted and need rest. Maybe you're anxious about the work and seeking distraction. Maybe you're lonely and seeking connection. There's always something underneath the behavior, but you can't discover it if you're attacking yourself. This is radically different from conventional self-improvement. Conventional self-improvement says, identify the bad behavior, create consequences for it, force yourself to change it. Integration says, get curious about the behavior, understand what it's trying to do for you, meet the need in a healthier way. One is violence. The other is relationship. You might notice that your resistance to change isn't stubbornness or weakness. It's actually wisdom. Some part of you knows that the change you're trying to force isn't aligned with who you really are. Maybe you're trying to become more extroverted because you think that's what success requires, but your nature is contemplative and introverted. Your resistance is your psyche protecting your authentic nature from being abandoned in pursuit of someone else's definition of success. The practice here is to slow down enough to listen. When you feel resistance, instead of overriding it, you can ask, what is this resistance protecting? What does it need me to understand? Sometimes the answer is profound. Sometimes it's simple, but it's always worth knowing. Calling a truce also means grieving. You have to grieve the fantasy of the perfect future self who doesn't have your struggles. You have to grieve the simple story where you're the hero who overcomes everything through sheer determination. You have to grieve the belief that somewhere out there is a system, a technique, a secret that will finally make you acceptable. This grieving is painful, but it's also liberating, because on the other side of it is reality, and reality, however messy, is where actual transformation happens. In practice, this might look like acknowledging, I'm never going to be the person who naturally loves waking up at 5 a.m., and that's okay. I can still have the life I want. Or, I'm always going to struggle with anxiety. It's part of my wiring, but I can learn to work with it instead of trying to eliminate it. These aren't statements of resignation. They're statements of reality, and reality is the only place where genuine change can occur. You begin to notice patterns differently. Instead of seeing your struggles as character flaws, you see them as the psyche's attempt to communicate. Your procrastination might be saying this goal isn't actually aligned with your values. Your people-pleasing might be saying you haven't learned that you're worthy of love without earning it. Your perfectionism might be saying you're terrified of being seen as inadequate. These aren't problems to fix. They're messages to decode. The integration process also involves learning to hold paradox. You can want to grow and accept yourself as you are. You can have standards and compassion. You can be disciplined and spontaneous. The war mindset says you have to choose. Integration says you can hold both. This is uncomfortable at first. Our minds want simple, binary answers. But life, consciousness, the psyche, these aren't binary. They're paradoxical, contradictory, mysterious. When you actually call a truce with yourself, something unexpected happens. You don't become lazy or complacent. You don't stop growing. Instead, you start growing in a completely different way. Instead of forcing change from the outside, change begins to emerge from the inside. It's organic, sustainable, aligned with your actual nature. You notice that you have more energy. This makes sense. You're not spending half your energy fighting yourself anymore. That energy becomes available for actually living. The exhaustion that characterized the war years begins to lift. Not because life gets easier, but because you're not adding the extra burden of self-rejection to every experience. Your relationship with failure transforms completely. Failure stops being evidence of your inadequacy and becomes information. Interesting, that didn't work. What can I learn? There's no self-flagellation, no shame spiral, no declaration that you need to try harder next time. Just curiosity, learning, adjustment. You start to fail better, fail faster, fail without the emotional devastation that used to accompany it. You discover that parts of yourself you thought were weaknesses contain unexpected gifts. Your sensitivity, which you tried to toughen up, turns out to be the source of your empathy and insight. Your tendency toward solitude, which you judged as antisocial, turns out to be how you recharge and access your deepest creativity. Your overthinking, which you tried to stop, turns out to be a sophisticated capacity for analysis and understanding. Once you stop fighting these aspects of yourself, you can actually use them. The truce doesn't mean everything suddenly becomes easy. You still have hard days, you still struggle, but the struggle has a different quality. It's no longer me versus me. It's me learning to navigate the complexity of being human. There's a gentleness that wasn't there before, a patience, a recognition that growth takes time, that setbacks are part of the process, that you're allowed to be human. Your standards don't disappear. If anything, they become clearer. But they're no longer weapons you use against yourself. They're compass points that help you navigate, and crucially, you hold them lightly. You're willing to question them, adjust them, let them evolve as you evolve. You're no longer attached to being right about who you should be. You develop what might be called compassionate discernment. You can see clearly where you're out of alignment with your values without the accompanying self-hatred. You can acknowledge, I'm not showing up the way I want to in my relationships, without the story that you're a terrible person. This clarity without cruelty becomes possible. Paradoxically, people often accomplish more after calling the truce than they did during the war. Not because they're trying harder, but because they're no longer sabotaging themselves. The shadow isn't undermining them anymore. The resistance isn't draining their energy anymore. They're aligned, integrated, whole. And wholeness is powerful in a way that force never can be. Remember Sarah and Marcus from the beginning. Here's what calling a truce looked like for them. Sarah didn't abandon her morning routine, but she learned to listen to her body. Some mornings she woke up at 5 a.m. because that's what felt right. Other mornings she slept until 7, and instead of judging herself, she noticed she needed it. The routine became a practice she chose each day rather than a prison she forced herself into. She was still disciplined, but the discipline came from alignment, not from self-rejection. Marcus didn't go back to forcing himself, but he stopped using acceptance as an excuse for stagnation. He got curious about why he felt stuck. He discovered that his burnout wasn't from trying too hard. It was from trying to be someone he wasn't. When he started pursuing goals that were actually his, not borrowed from others' expectations, energy returned. He was still accepting himself, but he was accepting the part of himself that wanted to grow too. Both of them discovered that the truce wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning, because you can't really grow while you're at war with yourself. You're too busy fighting to actually transform. But once you call the truce, once you turn toward yourself with curiosity instead of criticism, everything opens up. This doesn't mean the inner critic disappears. It doesn't mean you never judge yourself or struggle with difficult aspects of your personality. The truce isn't about eliminating conflict. It's about changing your relationship to conflict. It's about recognizing that you don't have to resolve the war through victory. You can resolve it through understanding. The great secret is this: you were never actually divided. The war was an illusion, a learned behavior, a story you told yourself about who you were supposed to be versus who you were. But you've always been whole, always been complete. The journey isn't about becoming whole. It's about recognizing the wholeness that was always there, hidden beneath the battlefield. When you see this, really see it, not just as an idea but as a lived reality, compassion floods in. Compassion for yourself, for all the years you spent fighting. Compassion for the part that thought fighting was necessary. Compassion for the vulnerability that made you build armor in the first place. And in that compassion, something softens. Something releases. Something comes home. You realize that the person you've been trying to become through all that force and effort and self-improvement. You already are that person, not because you're perfect, but because perfection was never the point. The point was always wholeness, and wholeness includes everything: the light and the shadow, the strength and the weakness, the success and the failure. This is the deepest transformation available to a human being, not the transformation from flawed to perfect, but the transformation from fragmented to whole. And it begins the moment you stop fighting yourself and start listening, the moment you call the truce. The war is over. You can come home now. You've always been enough. You've always been worthy. not because you achieved something, not because you fixed yourself, but because you exist. And existence itself, in all its messy, contradictory, beautiful complexity, is worthy of compassion. This is what it means to truly change, not to become someone else, but to become more fully yourself. Not through war, but through integration, not through rejection, but through acceptance, not through force, but through understanding. The truce is waiting. It's been waiting all along. All you have to do is lay down your weapons and see what's been there beneath the battle the entire time. You, whole and complete, exactly as you are, with infinite potential for growth, not because you're broken, but because you're alive.